The Realpolitik of global hegemony, the Realpolitik of swap lines, and the Realpolitik of how you invest your portfolio. That is what we are going to talk about today. And for anybody who's not familiar with the term Realpolitik, it's basically a philosophy of dealing with the world, oftentimes related to, kind of big international relations. But it's a way of dealing with the world based on pragmatism and hard truths and reality, as opposed to dealing with it based on political ideology or an idealistic belief of how the world should be. And that, I think, is really what we talk about a lot on this show, but it's becoming even more and more needed. And part of the reason it's becoming more and more needed is we're getting further down into the road where hard truths are being exposed and hard truths are having to be dealt with. And it's causing a lot of angst, a lot of concern, a lot of political intrigue, a lot of global international relationship disruption. However you want to describe it, it's becoming more and more chaotic. Now, it isn't chaotic yet, but I think a lot of people can sense that we're at least on the edge of it or getting closer to where it could become like that. And it's kind of bubbled up a lot recently with the election of Trump. And it's funny, every week we end up talking about Trump, and I often get accused of being a Trump lover, even though I would never in a million years vote for the guy, and I never have voted for him. But the reason that we talk about him so much is he is literally affecting all parts of the world in ways that just haven't been dealt with in a long, long time. And it's happening right at the same time that we're kind of hitting these same challenges from an economic perspective and a geopolitical perspective. So you throw somebody like Trump into the mix, and I guess you could probably argue the reason Trump got elected was because all of these other things were starting to percolate to the surface. And so we're kind of running into the intersection of global economics, geopolitical realities, domestic politics, and just a world gone mad. And so what I thought we would do today is break this down a little bit. And listen, I'm facing it on a daily basis with people I talk to, with people who I interact with on social media, when I talk to my clients about how we're going to allocate funds and how we think about things. And the really interesting one is the relationship between Canada and the United States. Now, if you haven't been paying attention, Trump, since being elected, has been joking around about Canada becoming the 51st state. And the reality is, he's not joking around. He would love Canada to be the 51st state. Now, he has not said that we're going to send in the tanks and we're going to drop bombs and we're going to annex Canada by military force, but he has indicated that he will use economic means to be more integrated and get Canada to cooperate more fully with his agenda. Same thing with Greenland. And, they're making moves on Greenland and they're making moves on the Panama Canal. And the reason this is so interesting to me, and the reason that we're going to talk about today, is I've kind of been talking about this for a number of years. And you guys may have remembered there's been times at different conferences, and maybe I am on this podcast, I made comments about how Canada would eventually become part of the United States. And not because I want this to happen, not because I think Canada's unimportant and it's not their own sovereign country and that the United States deserves to have Canada as part of it. And in many ways, I don't want to see this happen. But I've often made the joke that it was an inevitability. The joke I have made before, and part of the reason that some people like the joke and some part of the reason people don't like the joke is there's a little bit of truth to it. And that I said that the Canada was always like the United States attic. We're happy to let our friends live there while we don't need it. But the moment we need it, they're getting kicked out and we're taking it. Now, that's pretty rough language. And that's not exactly the way I would like to see the world work. But that's just a realpolitik analysis of the situation. And that goes hand in hand with global hegemony. And it goes hand in hand with global hegemony being challenged. And it kind of goes hand in hand with coming into a sovereign debt crisis. And so all of this stuff is related, right? But because Trump is who he is, and because Trump is how he is, anything he says is automatically deemed as many times wrong, incorrect, could never happen, should never happen, and we have to do everything we can to fight against this. And the thing that's pretty interesting to me about it is that people, despite Trump being around for a long time now, president for 4 years, in the 4 years he wasn't president, he was often on the stage talking about being president again, and now he's back in office again. People still react to him the same way they always have, and it never works. And they react to Trump by trying to out-Trump Trump. And it's funny to see people criticize him for his ineffectiveness and his rudeness, but then turn around and in many ways act exactly the way he's acting. In any case, as we get back to Canada, I need to say here, I love Canada. I've been to Canada several times. Vancouver is one of my favorite cities in the world. I think Banff is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. I have great friends that live in Nova Scotia in the eastern part of Canada. So, I have nothing bad to say about Canada. But the idea that Canada is on par with the United States from either an economic perspective, a military perspective, or a geopolitical perspective, it's just silly. It's not realpolitik. It's not dealing with the world as it actually is. Now, does this mean that Canada should just roll over and do whatever Trump wants them to do? Of course not. Of course not. But there's a way to deal with Trump and there's a way not to deal with Trump. And trying to out-Trump Trump is just not going to work. But the leadership in Canada, I believe, is trying to out-Trump Trump because it has skyrocketed them in the polls. And the Liberal Party in Canada was kind of on their way out, and Trump was just a godsend to them because they keep saying that they're gonna fight Trump tooth and nail, and he's the worst thing ever, and we don't need the United States, and we're going to end our relationship with the United States, and we're going to just become closer with Europe, and listen, and it's selling like hotcakes, and so they're skyrocketing in the polls, and they'll Carney will probably become the next prime minister as a result. But the reality of what they are saying, how they're going to deal with Trump now, and how they will deal with him when and if Carney wins the election, I think will be dramatically different. Not because Canada necessarily wants it to be different, because they don't really have another option. That's the reality of it. Canada has amazing resources, amazing geography. The idea that the global hegemon, who many people say is an evil empire, and who has ruled the world, badly and meanly and pushed their way and been a global bully for several years, the idea that entity is going to let their neighbor to the north that has all this amazing geography and amazing natural resources disalign with it and then realign with other people that are also against the United States, that is not dealing with reality. No global hegemon would do that. Now, I certainly don't want it to go down this path, and I certainly hope it doesn't go down this path, and I certainly hope that cooler heads prevail. But if we're actually taking that road and if we're wargaming that out to the end, there is no way that the United States lets that happen. First of all, the great resources that Canada does have mostly get sold into the United States. That's what this big thing is about, is because the United States is talking about putting tariffs on the goods coming into the United States. The reason Canada is so upset about that is that's a big part of their economy. So if they're not able to sell into the United States without those tariffs anymore, then they either have to sell them somewhere else or buy them internally. Well, the reason they can't buy them all internally is they don't have a big enough population to buy it all internally. And the idea that they are going to then sell all this production or all these resources to other parts of the world, how do they actually do it? Well, a big part of their economy is energy. Where do all the pipelines in Canada go to? They go into the United States. So how are they going to get all this energy to either China or to Europe? They don't have the infrastructure to do that. And as many people know, you can't just build that overnight. So that's Realpolitik problem number one. Let's say that they did have the ability. Let's say they did have pipelines going to the East Coast and the West Coast. They had refineries there, and they could put them on ships, and they could then ship them to Canada or to Europe and China. In a geopolitically unstable environment, do you think the global hegemon, the one that is so mean and that has ruled the world with an iron fist, is just going to sit back and let that happen? Of course not. So again, I'm not saying I want this to happen. I'm not encouraging this to happen. I hope to God I'm wrong and this never happens. But the idea that Canada can just stop importing stuff to the United States, start exporting the goods that were normally being sent to the United States to either Asia or Europe without any problems, and that they are going to economically thrive under this environment, it's just being silly, and it's not being prudent. It's not being it's not dealing with the world as it really is. Now, again, does this mean that they should just roll over and do everything Trump wants? Of course not. Of course not. But there's a way to deal with Trump, and there's a way not to deal with Trump. In my opinion, what they should have done is they should have just laughed. When Trump started talking about the 51st state, they should have just laughed, said Trump is ridiculous. Of course, we're not becoming the 51st state. But you know what? We've been the longest ally of the United States. We've got the longest international border in the world. We're best friends. We've been best friends forever. And we're going to figure out a way to make this all work for everybody. That probably would have calmed most of it down. But instead, they try to out-Trump Trump. And then things get more heated rather than less heated. And listen, I'm smart enough to know how to read a room. I know that many people in Canada who are listening to this right now saying, this is ridiculous. We shouldn't have done that. We're doing exactly what we should do. This is appeasement. They're calling Trump Hitler. And, if we would have done this to Hitler back in the 40s. I mean, everybody just needs to take it down a notch and realize that Canada and the United States are two of the biggest allies the world's ever seen. There are so many mutual synergies between the two. And yeah, is Canada going to have to deal with Trump for a while? Yeah, they're going to have to deal with Trump. I mean, listen, it's a brave new world. That is the realpolitik of the situation. But part of the other reason that this is all happening right now is because the United States isn't exactly in a great situation either. The United States has many problems that they're dealing with. And that is also part of the reason that Trump got into power, is because many people in the world didn't like, or many people in the United States did not like the problems that had happened. And they blamed the problems that had happened on political leadership of the last 40 or 50 years. And they liked what Trump said, and they wanted things to change. So Trump comes in with a mandate, and he is trying to fix many of the problems that now exist. Now, it doesn't matter to me whether I think Trump's on the right track or not. What matters to me is figuring out what he's going to do and reacting to it. So it's one thing to say you don't like Trump. It's another thing to say you do like Trump. But what I do here and what I do in my professional life is I manage people's portfolio. I deal with the world as it is and try to figure how to allocate assets based on what's really going to happen, the realpolitik of it. Not what I want to see happen, not what I hope happens, but what I actually think is going to happen. How can we protect our capital and how we can make money on it? And so that is what I focus on when it comes to Trump, when it comes to Vance. And these guys are not playing 3D chess. This is not some big secret strategy that they're employing. They are literally telling everybody around the world as loud as they possibly can exactly what they are going to do. And part of the reason they're doing it now is because of all the debt in the world, not just in the United States, but in the United States, but not just in the United States. Canada has debt problems. Australia has debt problems. Europe has debt problems. China has debt problems. This is the whole debt situation, and how a sovereign debt crisis plays out is the basis of the entire milkshake theory. That's where that's how I came to this in the first place. In many ways, the whole milkshake theory is trying to help people understand how things will play out in the real world as opposed to how we would like to see them play out. And so that's where we're at now. We have a guy that came into power with a mandate who is trying to upend the way the world has done business for the last 50, 60, 70 years. And the reason he's upending it is because the people who voted for him want things to be done differently. And he believes deep in his soul that for the United States to continue being the global hegemon, that things need to change. And so it doesn't really matter whether I agree with him or not. What matters is what he's going to do and how it's going to affect things both politically and economically, and what it means for our portfolios. The other reason that this is important, and the reason you try to war game all these things out, is the fact that, you've probably heard me say many times that the milkshake theory is in many ways the culmination of the Game of Thrones. That because the world is in trouble from a debt perspective, that because things are no longer going as great economically as they used to, as a result, the world is no longer cooperating as well as they used to. And you've heard me say this before. One of the oldest strategies in the world is when things start going bad domestically, you start blaming the evil foreigner, right? And so that leads to more tensions. And so all of this is kind of happening now. And as a result, you have the global hegemon doing everything it can to retain its power. And you have these other regional powers trying to figure out a way to climb that mountain. And maybe, by the grace of God, they actually get to the top of the mountain and take over that hegemony, right? But the reality is that despite all of the problems, despite all of the challenges, the United States still has an incredible amount of assets, an incredible amount of resources, an incredible amount of influence around the world. That's, again, the realpolitik of the situation. And the idea, even under the best case scenario, if any hegemon in history ever gets challenged, they're going to strike back. The idea that they would just roll over and hand it off to somebody else without a fight, it's just silly. It's just not reality. And, we need to deal with reality as we allocate our portfolios. And so when you see Trump doing these things, it's not that it's 3D chess. Again, he's telling everybody exactly what he's doing, but there is a method to the madness. He's trying to shore up the Western Hemisphere and the homeland in preparation for whatever bad things come down the pike. That's why he's trying to re-get control of the Panama Canal. It's why he's trying to get control of Greenland. It's why he's trying to form a stronger union with both Mexico and Canada, because this is becoming the Game of Thrones. And, whether by right or by might, that's what he is trying to do. And so that is why we need to kind of understand when Trump and Vance and Hegseth and Bessent, when they start saying that they're going to do these things, I think we need to stop thinking about them bluffing. I think they really mean it. And I think that they know that it's going to cause some pain. And perhaps it's going to cause a lot of pain. But the idea that you can go from doing business one way for 40, 50, 60 years to a completely new way without having some hiccups and volatility and unexpected consequences along the way, that's not reality. Of course there's going to be. And I think that they know that. So I don't think that people who think that just because there's starting to be some volatility in the stock market and things might not be going perfectly economically, that Trump and Bessent and Hegseth are just going to do a 180 and reverse policy. I don't think that's happening. I don't think that's reality. So I think what we have to do is deal with, with what they're saying and understand that they're going to follow through on what they're saying. Now, this is kind of leads into the swap lines that I was talking about. One of the realities is that the world, and this all goes back to the milkshake theory as well, is that the world has become addicted to debt. Not only addicted to debt, but addicted to US dollar debt. And while the United States has an incredible amount of obligations that they have to deal with, that they have borrowed, the United States can print the currency to do it. The rest of the world has also gotten addicted to debt. They've gotten addicted to Eurodollar debt or US dollar debt. And there's just as much debt. In fact, there's a lot more US dollar debt outside the United States than there is inside the United States. And those countries cannot print the dollars needed to service that debt and keep it going. So what has happened in the past when they have not been able to service that debt? Well, typically what has happened is as long as things are going good economically and economies are expanding and credit is being extended, everything takes care of itself. But what happens when you get a hiccup? What happens when you get a credit contraction? What happens when that Eurodollar market is no longer expanding? That's when you need somebody like the Fed to come in and recapitalize the system by doing QE, buying bonds, putting new reserves into the system. But the issue is that there is no entity outside the United States that can do that same thing for the Eurodollar market. So what has historically happened is that the Fed would extend swap lines. Now, swap lines are short-term, quote unquote, loans where credit is being extended from the Fed to the ECB, to the Bank of Japan, to the Bank of Canada, to I think Bank of Mexico's on there. It's to, I think, about a dozen global central banks. The way it works is that, let's just say the ECB says we need $2 billion. And so the US puts $2 billion in their account, and then the ECB pledges 2 billion euros to the Fed as collateral. The ECB then takes those dollars and says, okay, goes to their member countries, the individual countries, and says, how many dollars do you need? And they say, okay, we need 200 billion, we need 80 billion, we need 300 billion. So then those get loaned out to the individual countries. And then the individual countries go to their commercial banks. Okay, Santander, okay, Deutsche Bank, okay, Barings or Barclays, how much do you need? And so then, it just gets parsed out that way. And by recapitalizing the system through these swap lines, they kind of stop the downward flow of the credit contraction. And the idea is then when things, the kind of the lender of last resort type thing. But then the thing is when credit starts extending again, then these swap lines can get paid off. The banks pay back the central bank, the country central bank then pays back the ECB, and the ECB then pays back the Fed. And, it was basically those chairs got added to the game just to keep people from freaking out. Now, it just so happens that the US doesn't have to do this. The US could let them wither on the vine. And this is the way the Fed or the US can use the dollar as a weapon. They don't have to do this. They don't have to extend these swap lines. And because the rest of the world has, gorged on US dollar debt, that's also the reason that the US can use interest rates as a weapon, because they can, when the US raises interest rates, it puts pressure on the rest of the world, and then they can drop interest rates and it kind of make things a little less onerous for them. We saw that in 2020, 22. But the reason I'm talking about this now is last week, as again, a lot of it has to do with Trump coming into power, and he's kind of changing the way business has been done. And so there was an article last week about the European leaders are worried that the next time there is a hiccup in the Eurodollar market, that swap lines from the Fed may not get extended. Listen, and they should be worried. I mean, this is one of the things that I've talked about for a long time, is that the U.S. has the ability to turn off the tap whenever they want to. And does it hurt the United States? Yeah, it hurts the United States, but it crushes everybody else. And it seems now that the European leadership is starting to pick up on this, especially now with someone like Donald Trump in power. And they're worried that The next time there's a crisis or a slowdown or a credit contraction, that swap line may not be as prevalent as it has in the past. And it's a good reason to be worried. And the reason it's a good reason to be worried is because, again, going back to Trump, he has made it very clear that everything that the United States does has to be done in the interest of the United States. It's no longer we're doing this for the greater good. Every policy has to be done with the idea that the interests of the United States are being furthered. So, how is Trump going to react if Jay Powell is extending a swap line to the ECB, who extends it to the Bank of France, who then extends it to Airbus when Airbus is competing with Boeing, right? And so, these European leaders are worried, and listen, they should be worried. This is a Gordian knot that really can't be solved. And this has been one of the big reasons I've always said this will end with the dollar going higher, not going lower. But let's take that back to someone like Canada now. Now, Canada uses euro dollars as well. The whole world uses euro dollars. Canada just launched, they issued a sovereign treasury bond, a Canadian sovereign treasury bond issued in US dollars, right? So how can they ever pay that back if they are no longer trading with the United States, right? And no longer getting dollars as a result. Now, I'm just using this as an example because the reality is Canada's direct US dollar debt issued by the government is not that big. And they actually own more treasuries, I believe, than they owe in this sovereign bond. But the point is if they didn't need dollars, why are they issuing a US dollar bond to begin with? And how could they ever stop completely doing business with the United States if they're still going to use euro dollars for their business with the rest of the world? Because when they do business with the rest of the world, it's not being done in Canadian dollars. It's being done in US dollars. Same thing with, if you follow any of the smaller emerging market, Bolivia right now, Bolivia is in chaos because they can't get dollars. They're out of dollars and they can no longer get energy to run their economy. This is also a part of the reason why people are so upset about these tariffs. Tariffs reduce the flow of dollars to the rest of the world. That's the realpolitik of it. That is the fact. That is the reality. But, going back to the swap lines, my belief is that the swap lines will probably still be used, but they will be used very judiciously, and they will have a lot of strings attached to them going forward. They won't just be given because they're needed. And they will be given to the countries that agree to help the United States and further the United States' interests. This is no longer, we're going to do you a favor because you're our friend. This is we're going to do you a favor because it actually helps us. This is the reality of the situation. It isn't necessarily the world that we want, but this is the world that we have. But let's go back to those swap lines for a minute, because this is, I think, something that is not well understood. When the world has gotten into these credit crises, the Fed extends these swap lines and then basically increases the amount of dollars that are available to the rest of the world. But the actual loaning of the dollars, that's only part of it. The other reason they would extend swap lines, especially when it comes to the ECB, but it also, the same for other central banks as well, is that it's the Fed. Well, what's the first thing the Fed does? The first thing in a credit crisis, the first thing the Fed does is cut interest rates, right? And then they cut them again, and then they do QE. But the big thing is they want to get interest rates lower because they believe by getting interest rates lower, that will encourage more credit to be extended. It will encourage the less hoarding of those assets because they're not paying as much. And the idea is that it'll be cheaper for people to borrow, and then that will get the credit contraction under control, and then people will start borrowing again, and the economy will start expanding again. But a big part of it is dropping the interest rates. But the Fed only has direct control over U.S. interest rates. And even then, they only have direct control over short-term U.S. interest rates. They can do QE to kind of try to manage the longer end, but it's the short-term interest rates that they have direct control over. But let's go back to the euro dollar market. They do not or did not have direct control over interest rates, short-term interest rates in the euro dollar market. That was set by the British Bankers Association in London that would set LIBOR. LIBOR stands for London Interbank Offered Rate. The reason I know that is 30 years ago, I read the book Liar's Poker, and that was one of the questions that Michael Lewis got asked in his training program. He wrote about it in the book. And I always remembered that. And then when I was going through my training program in 1999, I actually got asked that question in my training program. And because I had read the book, I knew what it was. And so I had the answer. But anyway, that's just a little aside. But the point is that the British Bankers Association would set LIBOR. And the way they did it is they would go around to the banks and they would do a poll and they'd say, what rate are you quoting other banks, or what banks are, what rate are you able to lend at or borrow at between you and the other London banks? And then based on that survey they took, they would set the LIBOR interest rate. Well, one of the reasons, but in a credit crisis, that interest rate rises, right? The credit is not as free. So one of the reasons that the Fed would extend a swap line is because that's a way to offer borrowing, or, for banks to borrow at really, really low rates. So if the Fed loans it to the ECB, and then the ECB, loans it to, Bank of France, or if, the Fed extends a swap line to the Bank of England, and the Bank of England then extends it to the banks now are being offered very low financing. So the response they give when they're asked what's the rate they can borrow at, it comes down. And so that is a way that the Fed could kind of by proxy affect interest rates overseas. That's part of the reason swap lines would be extended. But because they didn't have direct control over it, they didn't really like that. And so that's why, when was it? I think it was 10 years ago, they started the process of transforming LIBOR into SOFR, because SOFR is something that is a domestic program, and that the Fed has more direct control over. So why is that important? Well, it's important because, again, the centralization of power in global markets is coming back to the United States. It's always been in the United States, but they're shoring up even the little programs like LIBOR. LIBOR was a big program because it kind of affected the entire euro dollar market, and the euro dollar market is huge. But that's the part of the point of that being transferred back to the United States, is to get that back kind of directly under the US control. So again, that's kind of the realpolitik of swap lines. And it's becoming more important now because we're getting into this situation where global economies are slowing, debt is growing faster than ever, and Trump is putting policies in that will restrict the supply of dollars to the global community. And when that happens, things are going to happen bad domestically in countries around the world, including the United States. And then that's going to cause countries around the world not to cooperate with each other, and in fact, blame each other for all their problems. That's then going to lead to geopolitical issues where they don't necessarily get solved on the economic battlefield, and unfortunately may get solved in the geopolitical or military battlefields. Again, hope to God that doesn't happen, but that's the progression that's we're seeing. That's what a Game of Thrones ends up being. And I think it's just important to kind of keep all of that in mind as you're allocating your portfolios. There is nothing more important, in my opinion. The whole reason I do this is to kind of help people understand what's going on. And I've been doing this for 25 years now. And listen, I certainly don't have everything figured out. And I certainly can't sit here and tell you exactly what's going to happen. But what I can do is I can tell you what I'm thinking, and I can share with you all the things that I've learned, and I can help you try to understand this big mosaic of a problem in the hopes that then maybe your portfolio does a little better. Again, here's the thing. I am not trying to change the world. I'm not one of these world improvers who is trying to enforce his will on the way everybody else should do things. I'm just trying to help people understand what's going on. And ultimately, the decision has to be up for you guys how you implement. I can give you ideas, but ultimately, you guys have to decide for yourself. But what I try to do is try to break through all the niceties. I know sometimes I don't say things the nicest way, and perhaps I could be a little bit more diplomatic when I make my points. But the whole point is to kind of get through the kumbaya of it all and get down to the hard reality, because there's nothing more important than protecting the capital that you work hard for, especially in the years that are coming. And so whenever we talk about this stuff, this is not the things I'm advocating for. I'm not saying this is the way it should be. I'm not saying these are the policies that I want Trump and Vance and everybody to do. These are just what I think is going to happen, whether I want them to happen or not. So to me, it's kind of a waste of time to sit here and talk about what I'd like to see happen, because it doesn't matter what I want. They're not listening to me. And this, kind of, I think last week I talked about how I kind of came up with the whole dollar milkshake theory in the first place. And I referenced a book that I had read, and it was a book by Bill Bonner called Empire of Debt. And in this book, he introduced me to this concept, or his concept of the world improvers. And he said it's the world improvers. It's those who think that they know better than everybody else. And not only think that they know better, but actually try to impose their will on everybody else, who end up causing all the problems that we then need to deal with. And I thought that was a fantastic way of saying it. And I think from an investment perspective, I think you have to separate your investment self from maybe your personal self. If you want to go change the world, either through some nonprofit you're involved in, or maybe you have a business that you think is really going to help change things, or you're a teacher and you're trying to, educate the next generation so that they can go out and listen. That is I fully support that. I think it's extremely noble, and I would encourage everybody to do that. But when it comes to your portfolio, I don't think you risk your hard-earned capital on the way you want the world to be. I think you invest your portfolio for a way that the world actually is, so that you can protect your capital and grow your capital, and perhaps then that frees you up to go out and try to, in your personal life, make the world a better place. But I'm not somebody who thinks that, the way I think the world should be, that should be imposed on everybody else. I don't consider myself a world improver. I have certain ideas of the ways I think should be, but I have no interest in forcing other people to believe that. I have no interest in forcing other people to follow that. But what I do have an interest in is helping people understand the world as it really is. And so I hope that people can sometimes look past my harsh language, my aggressive nature on occasions, because none of this stuff is ever personal. I know I get into some arguments online, and at conferences I'll get into debates and stuff, but it's never personal. It's really just trying to get down to the meat of the matter. But I brought this up 2 weeks in a row now, this book Empire of Debt. In some ways, I think it's still appropriate. It's probably 15 years old now, 20 years old now, but I think it's still appropriate, if for no other reason, to get an understanding of the challenges that the world has. So I would encourage you to read that, and I would encourage you to take special attention for the part about the world improvers. I think in many ways he nailed it when he said it's the world improvers who are the ones that cause 90% of the problem. So anyway, this was kind of a rant episode this week. I hope you guys found it valuable. Markets are kind of crazy right now. We had the big sell-off earlier in the month. We had a 2-week rally, and then we had a 3 or 4 day sell-off to end the week. So March is kind of going out on a sour note. So we'll see what happens this week, and I'll be back next week to kind of give you an update. In the meantime, stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon.